Welcome everyone. In the following, I'm showing you an excerpt of a dialogue that Daniel Taraba and I have recorded for our Dialogos course on the Japanese House of Being. So I present you with roughly 20 minutes of this dialogue so you get an idea what the course will be like. And if you'd like to join us, then please just follow the link in the description of this video so you'll find all the details on this course. We won't just read some of the most important Japanese thinkers for this course, and not only philosophy, by the way, also. So we'll be reading essays from novelists and also fundamental texts in Zen Buddhism. But we will also engage in philosophical practices, philosophical fellowship, and methods or ways of engaging in dialogos. So the course is an introduction to the Japanese way of being and seeing and hearing the world, of course, for us as foreigners to the great Japanese culture. We are entering them from this stance of being foreign to it, trying to encounter it in a genuine way. Daniel has spent time in Japan. He also knows Japanese. I don't. I come to this with almost like a blank slate, you could say. But as I'm reading more and more, I'm beginning to see that, especially in the Kyoto school, I think we can find ways to come out of our current predicament. So I invite you to join this course for, of course, it's the content, the material that we'll read, but at the same time also for the philosophical practices and methods that we will engage in together so that we become better listeners and dialoguers. Welcome everyone to our dialogue course on Japanese thought, where we will try to encounter the Japanese way of thinking and to make an experience with this other mode of thought and this other, as Heidegger would probably say, house of being, this other language. And Daniel and I have decided to begin this course with a dialogue between Heidegger and an unnamed Japanese scholar, precisely because in this dialogue, there is a dancing around the danger of language and translation itself, which we should heed as students of this course. And I include Daniel and especially myself in when I say students, I include us in there also. I come to almost all of these texts, except for the Heidegger essay and some excerpts from the idleness text that we'll also read. I come with no former knowledge, or even presumably also no understanding of them yet. So I will be learning in dialogue with Daniel, and then we will also be discussing what we see and how you see it in the seminars, and dialogue then with you all there. And the way in which that we will begin today with this dialogue is maybe briefly just to explain where this was published. So this is a book which in German is called Unterwegs zur Sprache. In English, it's On the Way to Language. And at the beginning of the dialogue, this unnamed Japanese scholar is presumably a figure Heidegger invents to summarize some of the dialogues he's had over the decades with individuals from Japan who had studied him, because they saw in Heidegger, and Daniel knows a lot more than me about this, they saw in Heidegger an entrance point or a possibility perhaps for an opening, let's say, an occasion for an encounter between the two languages, between the Japanese and the European, in a way that perhaps it would be less destructive. So I'll leave it at that for now and then let Daniel introduce his thoughts on this before we begin to discuss some of the most important dimensions and aspects of this dialogue.
So thank you, first of all, for the introduction. I would always summarize this dialogue between those two gentlemen, the Japanese and the inquirer, which is, right, Heidegger, as an exercise in releasement. Because the awareness of the danger, when we conceptualize some of the most important concepts. No, we already have the danger, so to say,
Yes.
that we encounter on this Japanese thinking path or thought path, kotoba, for example, or iki. And that's why this is also, right, a practice in releasing oneself and letting language or the say, as it's later called, show itself. And that we really heed to what is to this awareness that is, right, to this, let's say, the wellspring of this no-thingness, the emptiness, right, the no thing, the nothing that was at first, right, in the What is Metaphysics text from Heidegger, that was like there, the Japanese auditors, for the first time, they understood this, and they had then found an access point of contact, let's say, between the Japanese house of being and the European house of being in the person of Heidegger. So that will also be the one topic of this dialogue.
So to point out again that Daniel caught himself, as we are wont to do, to speak of concepts. The danger is precisely this, to assume, first of all, that there are always already just concepts floating about, even in European philosophical texts, or also in Japanese thought. Now, I will get to this in a bit, but I have to build the path there at first. The dialogue begins with a memorial address, you could almost say, with a remembrance of someone who has died, and that is the person called, the man called Count Shuso Kuki, who was a student of Heidegger's for many years. And this is pivotal, I think, that we have in the beginning a recalling of a fellow mortal being, and therefore also in a higher sense, a calling to mortal thinking, a remembering of mortal thinking. So the scene, as it were, is set against the experience of death, loss, non-availability, departure, but at the same time also in this return to the memory of Count Kuki. It is what binds these two men in their dialogue together, is the common and shared, not common perhaps, but the shared memory. They will still be different, of course, but the shared memory and affection for a student and a colleague and friend. They also then discuss, that is Heidegger and the unnamed Japanese scholar, the relationship that Count Cookie and Heidegger had, which serves not as some sort of aesthetical background or so, but points directly from the beginning to the heart of the matter, namely the question or the issue, the danger of language itself, which Heidegger says showed itself continuously throughout the dialogue that he had, or he actually says conversations, because they weren't in any sense official or staged or so. They met at home, at Heidegger's house often, to discuss or have conversations that then very quickly, though, led them not in what they said or how they said it, to the danger of language itself, insofar as what Count Cookie did or attempted was to import European concepts, let's say, and by European, we mean specifically coming from the French language, the English language, the German language, the Italian language, which are the languages of modern philosophy. For example, the word aesthetics, the word phenomenology. These were invented by Baumgarten. Christian Wolff. And used then also by Baumgarten and further used by Kant, etc. So these are specifically specifically humanistic European modes of representing certain issues or matters. And they have one advantage, says the Japanese interlocutor here, over the Japanese language. And that seems to be, he says, so it's very important that he says seems to be the following. It seems to be the case that they can grasp, Begriff in German, also very similar in English, the concept, so it's bringing together, so grasping together the issue, the heart of the matter, etc., in a neat concept that subsumes universalizing categorical sense all kinds of representations underneath it. So we can have the study of aesthetics, which then has several representations underneath it, etc. And we can use this to more firmly describe and define then the Japanese phenomena, or the Japanese encounter with world, with being, which is also already, saying a bit much, but still, we're trying to approach this. But this, at the same time, that precisely shows itself to be the danger. Why? It shows itself to be the danger because the Japanese way of speaking, and therefore also way of thinking and being with one another, and being in the world, or in the world being, is one. So the hand is moving. I'm myself not familiar at all with certain Japanese hand movements and what they mean, but they are pointed out here in the dialogue. That while for example in Italy, hand movements have a certain meaning, and they can be supportive also of what we say, and this is very pronounced in Italy, for example. To some degree, you will also find often philosophers, when they say essence, they move their hand like this when they say essence, because there is something that subsists here that's fundamental. But in Japanese, it might be even enough to make a certain gesture of the hand, and that in itself then lets arise a mountain range, which is also why Japanese theater doesn't need much of a stage, really. So it's a non-objectifying way of speaking, as it were. While the European languages, and explicitly the philosophical languages, and then very much the German language, is objectifying, is also reifying. We could maybe radicalize it and say to a certain degree it's ossifying. And while this gives precision and perhaps something like so-called clarity, this at the same time covers over, and I think now we're at the core of this, if there is a core. The core of this dialogue perhaps is, if we try to have a genuine encounter between the Japanese way of being and the European way of being. But we import European so-called concepts, terms, notions, ways of thinking or representing the world onto the Japanese, onto really, it's like it's being subjecting the Japanese to it. Then the encounter is itself not really possible. It is covered over by European concepts and also by our will, which is the will of the Renaissance, really, also by our will to understand and our will to control and then also manipulate through our knowledge. So the danger of language is here really the language itself. So what the language must do is it must release itself to a certain degree from its own will to dominate. So Daniel pointed out before that this is an exercise of releasement, which in German is Gelassenheit, which also means to einlassen, ne? Also sich selbst einlassen, to let oneself into this encounter with the other in such a way that I do not yet attack or approach the other in such a way that I already know what the other is saying, that the uncanny, this unknown, becomes immediately known to me. So one more then remark briefly before Daniel will continue is that the European mode then that Heidegger sees as prevalent, this where reason is the source of everything, reason with a capital R, as a goddess, as it was proclaimed, is conceptual representation. So we have a concept that's leading everything, and underneath it, all representations that fit within this schema are subsumed. And then when Daniel, in a bit, this will phenomenologically describe and let unfold the Iki and the Kotoba, we will see how different this is really from a Japanese mode of thinking. But it is precisely in this letting the other speak in its way that a genuine encounter can be possible, and then also not to see that they are really foreign and there's nothing uniting them, quite the opposite. In letting the otherness of the other and the genuine cut or difference, schism, show the oneness of this manifold comes to the fore also. And this is why also the Japanese interlocutor says at some point that when he was translating Heinrich von Kleist or Hölderlin and a few others, that his translations, his Übersetzen, so the Übersetzen can also mean to move from one shore of the sea to the other side, is like hiking. So this translation of the languages is like hiking between different realms of language.
So the first thing I just want to say is that Count Kuki thought that the Japanese language is too ambiguous, because the Japanese language can express a multitude of moods, shades of emotions. And as we also learn in the dialogue, and that's very true, that not even the topic of the conversation must stand fully out in the open. It can be concealed and hidden. It must not be present for everyone's gaze, so to say. And that is a crucial difference between European languages and the Japanese language. Kuki himself thought that the Japanese language was inadequate for rigorous thinking, and that's why he thought the Japanese language needs the help of the European languages, because there you have, as you said, right, concepts with whom we then can think and operate and work philosophically. But that is in itself this forceful translation is in itself a great danger, as we see, for example, and I will just briefly read this from the dialogue itself. We say iro, that is color, and say ku, that is emptiness, the open, the sky. We say without iro, no ku. That is this famous Buddhist dictum, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, or without form, no emptiness. Without emptiness, nothing can arise, right? And there then is the danger that we just assume that this is the same as the aestheton, which can be perceived by the senses, and the noeton, the non-sensuous, the suprasensible, from Greek metaphysical philosophy. And then the Japanese interlocutor says, I fully share your fear, for while iro does indeed name color, it yet means essentially more than whatever is perceptible by the senses. Ku does indeed name emptiness and the open, and yet it means essentially more than that which is merely suprasensuous. And the same problem arises with the discussion of iki, which is in the dialogue described as the sensuous radiance through whose lively delight there breaks the radiance of something suprasensuous. So kind of like the shining of the suprasensus into the sensible, which is, if I'm not mistaken, a very Hegelian definition of aesthetics. And then where this danger is really strong is with koto, this word that is not even in religion and nothingness. And for example, from Nishitani, this word is not translated because it's very dangerous to translate it, because it means something like thing, affair, matter, word. And there is no corresponding German or English word that really comes close to it, and that's why it's untranslated. And that's why the Japanese interlocutor is also very hesitant to translate it, because I think it can't be translated. There we have a refusal of the binding of this language, and there this will also that has shaped itself through the movement of reason since the Renaissance, which you explained so nicely. Here is a point, we have reached a point where not everything can be fully conceptualized, and we have to deal with the binding of language that does not give in, let's say, to the forceful empowerment of reason that wants to kind of like operatively control everything and wants to work with everything. So this is really the danger that we find here.